lectures. I am happy to be able to play a little role here, and it will be really pivotal by introducing our speakers and answering questions for them at the end. Our first speaker is Stephen Zohn, who has published widely on 18th century topics, particularly on the music of Carl Philipp Emanuel and the Bach-family. He is the author of Music for the Mixed Taste, Style, Genre, and Meaning in Telemann's instrumental works, which received the William H. Schneider Prize of the American Bach Society. He's also the editor of volumes for the Philipp Emanuel Bach and Telemann critical editions, and co-editor of the journal 18th-century Music. He's also active, as you all heard very impressively last night, as a performer on historical flutes. His contributions to the study and performance of early music has been recognized by the American Musicological Society with its Noah Greenberg Award. He is currently the Laura H. Cornell Professor of Music History at Temple University. And he will be speaking to us today on the irrational, picturesque, and sensible Sara Levy and musical aesthetics of the Berlin Bach Opera.
Thank you, Bob. And as you will see, my paper has evolved a bit since the abstract was written. Even in Berlin, where the music of Johann Sebastian Bach enjoyed late 18th century afterlife through the advocacy of his sons and former pupils, the extensive cultivation of Bach-family music by the Itzig clan was remarkable. The veritable Sebastian and Emanuel Bach helped Johann Friedrich Reichardt witness at the house of banker Daniel Itzig was maintained above all by his daughter Sara Levy well into the 19th century. As a prominent keyboardist and salonnière, Levy studied with Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, corresponded with Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and evidently commissioned works from both. Her enthusiasm for the music of the Bach family, along with mid-century works by Berlin composers associated with the court of Frederick the Great, has been cited as evidence of a conservative-enlightened musical taste that gradually ossified over several decades, beginning in the 1770s. Today, I wish to re-examine this musical taste with reference to shifting aesthetic trends during the late 18th century, especially as seen in compositions closely associated with Levy. What I hope to show is a mixture of old and new, conservative and progressive, that revealed her personal music collection and salon to have been not only a living museum of German instrumental music, but also a potential agent of stylistic change. Levy's manuscript copies of music by Sebastian Bach include a representative sampling of keyboard and chamber works from across the composer's career, from the early D major toccata BWV 912 and the English and French suites, to more mature works such as the organ trios, selections from the well-tempered clavier, sonatas for violin or flute and obbligato harpsichord, and keyboard concertos that she performed publicly over several decades. It should come as no surprise that included in this list are compositions that Emanuel Bach considered to have aged particularly well. In 1774, he wrote to Johann Nicholas Forkel that his father's violin and keyboard sonatas, quote, still sound excellent and give me much joy, although they date back more than 50 years. They contain some adagi that could not be written in a more singable manner today. And as the presumed author of a comparison between Sebastian Bach and Handel, published in 1788, Emanuel noted that the organ trios are, quote, written in such a gallant style that they still sound very good and never grow old, but on the contrary will outlive all revolutions of fashion in music. Nevertheless, Sebastian's music, especially the keyboard suites, could hardly be seen as especially progressive during the last quarter of the 18th century. And so Levy's interests in it speaks mainly to the antiquarian side of her musical taste. Among the more interesting of Levy's Sebastian Bach manuscripts is a set of parts to the E-flat sonata for flute and obbligato keyboard, BWV 1031. The title page bears her ownership stamp in the upper left and right-hand corners, circles containing S.S. Levy for Sara and Emanuel Levy. The anonymous copyist attributed the work simply to Bach. Early in the 19th century, Carl Friedrich added Johann Sebastian, but then crossed this out, adding the explanatory comment, zu viel air, too much on it. Thus Zelter, perhaps the copyist of the title page before him, was uncertain as to who had composed the sonata, an uncertainty that extends to the present day. Even more interesting is the scoring for flute, violin, and continuo, which is unique among the sources for the work. Is this conventional trio sonata scoring, in which the familiar keyboard right-hand part is played by the violin and the left-hand part is assigned to continuo, simply the reverse of a common arranging process whereby obligato keyboard parts are derived from lines originally assigned to melody instrument and continuo? Or might the Berlin scoring reflect the piece's original conception? In this connection, Ulrich Leisiger's and Peter Wollny's 1993 observation that the keyboard part of the E-flat sonata lies poorly in the player's hands, and Gene Swack's 1995 proposal that the piece was originally scored for flute, violin, and continuo take on added resonance. One imagines that for Levy, as for Emanuel Bach and contemporary writers such as Vogel, Carl Ludwig Juncker, and Johann Friedrich, music was primarily a language of sentiment, of feelings, emotions, empfinden, of sensibility, sensitivity, Empfindsamkeit, that could make a strikingly modern effect. Heinrich Christoph Koch, whose compositional hero was Emanuel, wrote in 1787 that, quote, "The feelings may follow one another only as they do according to the nature of our soul. The composer may not leave any gaps, and he may not jump randomly from one feeling to the other. By proceeding in this way, the music will not allow the listener, once affected, to retreat into himself so easily. The music will carry him on." The surface discontinuities, digressions, ellipses, and sense of caprice characteristic of Emanuel's music, and to a lesser degree in Friedemann's, represent an aspect of this emotional language that found its most concentrated expression in the free fantasia for keyboard. Such works, many of which were owned and presumably played by Levy, bared the composer's soul like no others, and therefore allowed his presence to be strongly felt, even in his physical absence. They were also vessels for boldly original thoughts and flashes of genius, famously combined in the person of Emanuel, who was regarded as an original genius by his contemporaries. The free fantasia has been compared to the picturesque landscapes of English gardens, with their cultivated yet irregular and seemingly untamed topography. As Emanuel demonstrated in his essay on the true manner of playing keyboard instruments, an irregular and untamed fantasia is in essence the expressive surface elaboration, or cultivation if you will, of a rational tonal framework. Two fantasias from Levy's collection will suffice here as examples of what we may call the expressive aesthetic, one centered in the composer's individual feelings and those they may elicit in the performer and listener. First, Friedemann's D minor fantasia Falke 19, played so beautifully last night by Rebecca Sykes, and a work evidently composed in Berlin during the 1770s or 1780s. The piece consists of an alternation between three contrasting elements, two of which are seen here: rapid figuration in triplet rhythms, slow dotted rhythms reminiscent of the opening section of the French overture, and marked by chromaticism, and a fugue. The two fugal passages are related but distinct. For the second one, shown on the right, has the same subject as the first, but introduces a new counter-subject and episodes before recapitulating the exposition of the first fugue. Here we see two important aesthetic categories for music in Berlin: learnedness, most often expressed through canons and fugues, and Veränderung, or variation, involving the elaboration of existing material. Friedemann, as the chief inheritor of his father's interest in learned counterpoint, was more likely than other composers to insert fugues into his free fantasias. For his brother Emanuel, the unpredictability of such pieces usually demanded that strict contrapuntal procedures be avoided. His well-known C major fantasia was published in 1785 in the fifth volume of his keyboard music for tenor and glee opera, to which Levy and several members of the family were advanced subscribers, or prenumeranten. The opening of the piece, shown here, presents an upward arpeggio motive that is the basis for much of the composition. The performance I'll play is by the conductor and musicologist Christopher Hogwood, who, as some of you may know, died last week. Hogwood was a passionate advocate of Emanuel Bach's music, and this 1977 recording of the piece is the first I ever heard, and it still gives me much pleasure. Whereas the unpredictability of Friedemann's fantasia becomes, well, predictable after a certain point, Emanuel's fantasia is full of surprising and unexpected elaborations. In some of his lesser pieces, this quality can lead to a sense of incoherence or randomness, but the expressive effect here is instead cumulative. The touching ending of the piece is a good example of how Emanuel is able to elicit an emotional response from the listener, how he projects his own feelings and even personality through the ingenious elaboration of relatively simple material. Turn now to one of the latest works in Sara Levy's musical collection, the D major quartet for flute, viola, and keyboard that we heard last night. You will recall that it is one of three such works composed by Emanuel for Levy in 1788. Why did Bach compose quartets of all things? In its traditional scoring for three melody instruments in continuo, the quartet was a rarefied genre during the 18th century. No examples had previously been composed by Sebastian Friedemann or Emanuel Bach, for example, and few writers had bothered to describe the quartet in detail. One of these was the Royal Prussian flute instructor Johann Friedrich Reichardt, who wrote in 1752 that, quote, a quartet or sonata with 3 contrapunting instruments and a bass is the true touchstone of a genuine contrapuntist, and is often the downfall of those who are not solidly grounded in its technique. Its vogue has never been great, hence its nature may not be well known to many people. Yet Sara Levy appears to have taken a special interest in the quartet. Besides several published examples by Johann Friedrich Bach, she owned quartets in manuscript by Carl Philipp Emanuel and the Berlin composers Franz Johann Gottlieb Gramm and Johann Gottlieb Janitsch. Significantly, the Berliners had all featured the viola as one of the 3 obligato instruments, perhaps following Telemann's lead in pairing flute and violin with viola da gamba. Whether or not Levy specified the scoring of Emanuel's quartets, they may be seen as belonging to a long tradition of such works. But the replacement of lines for treble instrument and basso continuo with an obligato keyboard part marks them as thoroughly modern, related both to the duo, the melody instrument and keyboard, and the even more fashionable accompanied piano sonata, which eventually led to the piano trio with fully independent parts for violin and cello. Emanuel may have calculated that this particular combination of tradition and innovation would hold great appeal to Levy and her circle. Indeed, these are among the composer's most stylistically progressive instrumental works. Ernst Fritz Schmidt, the first modern editor of the quartets, saw in them a complete breakthrough to the Viennese classical style, while Hans Günther Ottenberg considers them the clearest illustration of the interconnections between Bach and Haydn, and even detects the imprint of an incipient romantic idiom. Distancing himself from such views, David Schulenberg notes that the quartets embody a relatively restrained musical language, avoiding the more extreme types of modulation and fragmentation found especially in the late pieces for solo keyboard. Without denying the merits of each of these views, and I myself have long imagined Haydn lurking behind many passages, none fully accounts for the music's aesthetic orientation, one that was indeed new for Emanuel. More than any other instrumental genre, the quartet, with its potential for intricate textures and kaleidoscopic shifts between instrumental tone colors, invites comparison to polite conversation. Christoph Wolff has noted in Emanuel's quartets, quote, an evenly balanced instrumental discourse that permits the composer to engage in a lively, intense, and witty musical dialogue, in all likelihood a fitting interlude to the verbal conversations invariably conducted among the guests of Sara Levy's literary musical salon. I suggest that it is precisely this conversational quality that marks the music as exceptional within Emanuel's output, and which may remind us of the international, listener-friendly style encompassing the personal idioms of a Haydn, of a Johann Friedrich Bach, or an Ignaz Pleyel. But the quartets represent a shift away from the aesthetic of self-expression that we encountered in keyboard fantasias, and one toward emphasizing human deportment and sociability. The discourse here is one of constant qualification, of always conceding another point of view or mode of expression. It is relativistic rather than revelatory. This mirrors the idea of sociability as an organizing concept of society. In the words of Carolina Pichler, Levy's counterpart as Vienna's most prominent salonnière, der Mensch ist zur Geselligkeit geboren. Man is born to society. That is, our essence depends on interactions with others. Studies of musical sociability have been relatively few, with W.D. Sutcliffe having offered the most sophisticated examples to date. But he and others have focused on the generation of composers following Emanuel Bach. What makes Emanuel's quartet such an inviting object for this kind of analysis is the fact that they were intended to be played and heard in a salon setting, and a specific salon at that. Few other chamber works at the time could be so closely connected to such a venue, one in which conversation was more of a central focus than in other performance settings. Thus, it is fair to ask whether Bach consciously adopted a more conversational mode of expression in these works. I'd like to play the opening page of the quartet's first movement, and this is a recording featuring Sara Levy, who we will hear play a little later today. our attention with its loud dynamic level, unison texture, tutti scoring, and portentous dotted rhythms. One could be forgiven for hearing this gesture as orchestral in conception. Think an opera overture hushing up the audience before the stage action commences. And the unusual placement of a tenuta marking on the first beat, countering the player's instincts to cut the quarter note a bit short, signals Bach's desire for the sustained and weighty sound associated with so-called heavy execution. What follows in the second measure could not be more different. Loud turns to soft, dotted and slower rhythms to even and faster ones, and unison texture to a homophonic one featuring the solo flute supported by a passetto accompaniment in the viola. The absence here of a true bass line contributes to a feeling of instability, as does the implied half cadence. The flute's lyrical legato line is unabashedly vocal in conception, as if the orchestra's curtain-raising overture has now given way to the opera's first aria. But in conversational terms, we have what Sutcliffe calls a gracious riposte, an opening statement meant by a contrasting point of view or polite contradiction. A light execution and decorated continuation of the opening gesture follows in measures 3 and 4, confirming the opening half cadence and providing a counterweight to the first two measures as a unit. When the flute re-enters in measure 5, now it has higher tessitura, we sense that it has begun to soften its position. Even and still faster rhythms are now mixed with dotted ones and flighty triplets, and brief, breathless phrases take the place of the earlier legato line. The viola falsetto remains, but is now constructed of a descending octave progression, an accompanimental device conventionally associated with serious sentiments, thus lending a sense of effective dissonance to this passage. Two more solos round out the first 10 measures of the movement. First, a brief outburst of right-hand figuration in the keyboard, accompanied by suspensions, perhaps intended as mock serious, between flute and keyboard left hand, and then another variant of the flute with passetto texture, the soloist's line, a disjunct descent of more than an octave. To this point, each shift of texture, instrumentation, and topic has occurred within a framework of two measured phrases, suggesting a collegial give and take. But starting in measure 11, the discourse becomes less schematic by close imitations and phrases that are longer, irregular, and frequently aligned. Brief rhythmic motives begin to assume quasi-thematic status, while the keyboard gradually emerges as primus inter pares, and the flute's utterances become progressively less distinct from that of its companions. At the same time, the viola begins to do more than nod its head in agreement during the flute-keyboard exchanges, assuming an increasingly thematic role until, at measure 31, it finally speaks its mind in one of the longest solo passages of the movement. Who knew she had so much to say? The other instrumentalists think as they smile at each other. We are by now in the midst of the second key area in what Schulenburg aptly describes as a flute-composed sonata form. And the opening up of the discourse I have just described continues through to the recapitulation in measure 53. It's unnecessary to hear the last third of the movement as the conversation winding down, each of the participants offering varied restatements of their earlier positions, for it was surely not Bach's intention to portray the progress of an actual conversation from start to finish at the expense of formal convention. He had already done this precisely back in 1751, during the first two movements of a programmatic trio sonata he described as a conversation between a sanguineous and melancholicus. And here's the opening page of the score. The fact that imitating a conversation required not only through composed forms, but also extreme contrast of material between the violinist speakers, not to mention explanatory text key to specific passages in the score, points up the limitations of this expressive use of the language to suggest social interaction. This example of what Schulenburg has called Emanuel's dialoguing principle typically involved jarring contrasts of conventional sonata or concerto style with fantasia style. On the other hand, the more sociable language of the D major quartet, written nearly 40 years after the program trio, can convey at least the broad outlines of the conversation, its free exchange and development of ideas, the speakers jockeying for position, and so on, without resorting to similar types of stylistic, formal, and generic distortions. The quartet's second and third movements are perhaps less susceptible to this kind of explication, but the slow movement's main thematic idea, consisting of a scalar descent from dominant to tonic pitches, is repeated in various forms almost continuously and both begins and ends the movement. One has the sense of an open-ended conversation. A central idea is elaborated upon almost obsessively without leading to any clear conclusions. It is a sort of serious version of the finale of Haydn's famous Joe Quartet, which plays with listeners' expectations that opening and closing phrases are inherently different. Speaking of jokes, there's a fine one in Bach's own finale. And I'll just play this passage. Whereupon it is answered by rising figures in the flute and viola, the opposite direction of what we had previously heard. What promises to be a repetition of this exchange is instead another silence, only to be followed by a foreshortened exchange. The effect is deliberately disorienting in true Haydnesque fashion. But we need not hear this passage as an homage to Haydn's quartets, for as the historian William Weber reminds us, the 18th century's sense of propriety abhorred speaking in excessively serious terms. This type of humor or wit is an almost inevitable byproduct of the movement's self-conscious discursive style, full of qualification and relativism. By focusing on the quartet's sociability, I hope to have suggested how an aesthetic shift in Emanuel's late music from inward to outward expression mirrored not only the culture of Sara Levy's salon, but also developments among the younger generation of composers. In this respect, it is tempting to draw a parallel with Emanuel's father, who had embraced the new galant musical aesthetic, if only half-heartedly, many decades earlier. Such a parallel may not have been lost on Levy and her salon companions, as they discussed the different manifestations of musical expression encompassed by nearly a century of Bach-family music. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. I think we should take them now, rather than at the very end while the paper is gives us through fresh. Are there any questions for Professor Zohn? Yes?
Thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful. Thinking about sociability and music in response to the salon, that just seems really, really smart and really great. It reminds me, thinking that maybe another model is in the 17th century, of course, French salon, and the literature that we have from the précieuse, whereby there's this sense of the real playfulness, say, in the composition of the air sérieux. And so we've got a kind of body of literature, at least for that time, that really attests to the way in which the songs that were being composed fit into the larger salon culture. So those so often have to do with love and desire and all of this kind of intricate stuff. So my question for you, and I have no vested interest in the answer, I'm just curious, is you think there's a gender quality, would there be a way to read this, or would you even want to read some of this discourse in terms of some of the things we're dealing with later, the mixture of men and women in the salons, whatever, is there a broader way to think about this discourse? Or would you even want to? Again, I'm not pushing you to do it, I'm just curious.
Well, this type of reading, I think a lot of us are hesitant to undertake because it seems like we're reading in very specific qualities into something that's surely meant, surely meant to be a bit more nebulous. But I think it's possible, and I mean, I'm attracted to this piece because I know it was written for salon, But nevertheless, I think the approach that I've taken is one that's normally, say, according to Mozart, for example. And we're not too shy about identifying, well, this passage sounds like this kind of music, and this reminds me of that. And generally, Emanuel doesn't do that kind of thing, but here he seems to. But I would be hesitant to sort of extend that further and say, well, who's talking, and what about exactly, without a text.
Diana?
Just to kind of pick up on that, I'm wondering whether the fruit might have here any gendered meaning. Thinking of Frederick the Great as sort of the flautist par excellence, or the prototype flautist in Berlin, starting his early salon, and her husband, who was a flautist, as far as I know.
Well,
See,
yeah.
can you see the video? I know the mic is a little low for your height, but if you could repeat Yael's question, I'm sure comments, I think many people didn't hear.
Okay, so the question is what gendered associations may we have with the flute, the association with Frederick the Great, and Hans, and then Zohn, and I think that, well, that might actually be a way to sort of answer your question a little bit if we imagine this as sort of a dialogue, husband and wife dialogue, I suppose. I don't know where the viola fits in as a sort of mostly quiet bystander for much of the first movements, sort of launching this marital discord, perhaps silent, horrified. But that I think that offers some potential without knowing who we play. And of course, we often see the flute is gendered female, but maybe not really. Maybe it's the opposite, and that's an interesting story to tell in itself.
Another question?
Yes. Thank you so much, Samantha. That's very deeper. I wanted to ask about the thesis about the sort of development of Philipp Emanuel's style. Obviously the programmatic sonata from the 1750s, which tracks a real conversation through music. That's a very early work that maybe foreshadows some of the conversationalist tendencies that you're reading in the late quartets. And at the same time, at the end of his career, he's still writing, even more intensely, these very personal fantasies associated with the so-called cult of solitude. So it seems that maybe one could trace the themes that you're finding in his music throughout his entire career, and so it's responding to different contexts.
Certainly, I think I mentioned to Dean Sutcliffe as I was trying out this approach on Emanuel Bach. Oh, yeah, it really works for Emanuel, but I haven't seen it in the earlier music. And the point I was trying to make about the programmatic trios, that's a different musical language, and to convey conversation, you have to resort to these kinds of. That's a long tradition of actually having text-keyed music, not only with all these four seasons, but a lot of other works as well. And so I think I see that piece coming out of that tradition, whereas this one is a musical language that is inherently conversational. You don't need that crutch. But I think you're right. This may be an abiding interest of Emanuel, and he's just found a different way to express himself now, perhaps.
Another question? Well, let me just ask. This is, of course, written in the late 1780s. And by the 1780s, there seems to be something of a consolidation of musical style into what we now call the high classic style, dominated primarily by the Viennese composers. And this is written a few years after Haydn publishes his Opus 33 quartets, which has famously the joke quartet in it, which is, I can't help but feel that is something of a homage to what Haydn has done. And can it be that Philipp Emanuel now is maturing with the general maturation of musical style in the course of the 18th century, in that period of transition between the death of Sebastian and the consolidation of the high classic in the 1780s is now pretty much concluded. Things have congealed into a new norm, and that Philipp Emanuel is going with that trend and is reflecting it.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. We know that Emanuel Bach knew Haydn's music. We don't know what he knew exactly, but he was clearly familiar with it. And that's one possible explanation, and I don't need to discount that, but I think what may be going on is that he's responding to the same aesthetic trends that Haydn is. In other words, they're adopting a similar language. Bach talked about language that you're going to get humor involved as a kind of social virtue, in a conversation like that. But maybe he did rip off Haydn, perfectly willing to consider that.
Haydn, Philipp Emanuel, so maybe Philipp Emanuel.
Yeah, I think just to add a comment, Haydn studied C.P.E. Bach's music from the very beginning. So he is really intimately familiar, particularly with the keyboard music. And we always paid attention to Haydn's music because it was so well known. The C.P.E. Bach repertoire is by far not as well known as Haydn. So in a way, Haydn is conducting a dialogue with C.P.E. Bach for a very long time. And I think towards the end, since I think in the 70s and 80s, C.P.E. Bach also became familiar with Haydn. So I think Haydn then, when he returned from London, wanted to visit with Bach, but Bach had just died. So I think he is a very important kind of father figure